Thank you, Kent. We're highly honored to have the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Commandant of the Coast Guard, and Vice Chief of Naval Operations with us here today. I'll do a couple of short introductions. Not that these gentlemen need an introduction, but I think they rate it. Marine Corps Commandant General Jim Amos has commanded at all levels in the Marine Corps, from Lieutenant Colonel to Lieutenant General. A naval aviator and fighter pilot, he served in 4 squadron tours, flying the F-4 Phantom II, and later commanded Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 312, deploying the squadron as part of Air Wing 8 on board the Theodore Roosevelt. As commanding general of the 3rd MAW, he commanded all Marine aviation forces in Iraq in 2003 on the march to Baghdad. He's also commanded 2 MEF, Marine Expeditionary Force, and the Marine Corps Combat Development Command. He became the 35th Commandant of the Marine Corps on 22 October 2010. Let's welcome General Jim Amos. Admiral Bob Papp, U.S. Coast Guard, is a career cutterman who has served in 6 cutters, commanding 4 of them, including America's tall ship, the Bark Eagle. He commanded at all levels in the Coast Guard, and his most recent operational tour was as Commander, Coast Guard Atlantic Area in Portsmouth, Virginia, where he was the operational commander for all Coast Guard missions within the eastern half of the world. His experience spans the Atlantic, Pacific, Caribbean, Great Lakes areas of operations. He became the 24th Commandant of the Coast Guard on 25 May 2010 and leads the largest component in the Department of Homeland Security. Let's welcome Admiral Papp. Admiral Mark Ferguson is the 37th Vice Chief of Naval Operations. He is a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer. As Vice Chief, he is the XO of the Navy, where as second in command, he focuses his efforts on the Navy's budget, readiness, leadership development, ethics, family support, and the business of the Navy. He has been confirmed to relieve this spring as Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Africa, and Commander, Allied Joint Forces Command, based in Naples, Italy. Let's welcome Admiral Mark Ferguson, please. We'll get right into questions here. It's been an important 2 years since the defense strategy gave increased emphasis to the Asia-Pacific region. And the recent planning and execution environment has been sporting, to say the least, as several important events have been going on concurrently. The Navy and Marines have been working on the Quadrennial Defense Review with the other services in the Pentagon. The Coast Guard has been receiving similar scrutiny on their end at Homeland Security. All 3 are in the throes of closing in on their final budgets, and also at the same time getting revised fiscal targets, both for the current year but also for the future years. There's a lot of elements moving at the same time. Against this backdrop, they are revising the Maritime Strategy, which is our focus today, shaping the Maritime Strategy. The world continues to place very high demands on Naval and Coast Guard forces, and we look forward to a terrific discussion today about just that. So we'll get right into it. Thank you. This first question I was going to give to the Vice Chief and let him break the ice. He was elected to do that by General Amos and Admiral Papp. For the Vice Chief, Admiral Ferguson, what are some of the major ways that you have seen the security environment change since the last Maritime Strategy was published in 2007, and how have they informed your current thinking as you work towards revising the strategy?
Yeah, Peter, as we look at changes in the security environment, since 2007, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the dramatic increase in the proliferation of weapons and technologies capable of denying access or freedom of action in the global commons. For us, that's been a driving factor. I think the emergence of space and cyberspace as contested domains and investment by many nations in other domains where we've had an advantage in the future. We're seeing increased political instability and conflict, just not only in the Levant, but it's also increasing the demand from the COCOMs for naval forces that are present in theater forward. We're seeing the migration of al-Qaeda from a centralized organization to kind of a franchise global network that in many cases overlaps with criminal networks around the globe. And then, of course, as you've talked about in the conference, the flashpoints and potential flashpoints in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think I have to mention, as you mentioned, you know, the uncertainty, the change in the U.S. fiscal position that we've seen since 2007. In 2007, our national debt was about 64% of GDP. Today, it's 101% of GDP. Defense spending is about 4.4% of that. So you see this tremendous pressure driving our decision-making as we look to the strategic environment. Let me just tell you quickly, you know, ways it drives our thinking. First of all, it's caused us to focus a lot on air-sea battle and an organizing concept for both how we are going to fight in the future and use cross-domain capabilities to obtain objectives at the operational level of war. I think as we shift from 2 land wars to the challenges that we see in the COCOMs, it puts a premium on presence forward. And so you see us starting to shift assets forward in that domain. It places a premium on partnerships. The CNO could not be here today because he's in the Philippines and visiting our other partners in that region. And so, you know, it places a premium on those types of partnerships around the globe. And then lastly, it's caused us, I think, at the service chief level as well as the COCOMs to really focus on this very tight circle of strategy of ends, ways, and means, and to start to think about their very tight coupling where, you know, means are constrained, then you have to think about ends and ways, and how that affects us in terms of the risk calculus for achieving American national security objectives.
Thank you. For Admiral Papp, as DoD continues to rebalance, how has that impacted the Coast Guard's view of things and your strategy? And can you tell us about some of the efforts that you're currently pursuing in this part of the world?
Sure. First of all, Pete, thanks for having me here. The Naval Institute and AFCEA and other organizations as well, but the Naval Institute in particular has always been very sensitive to including the Coast Guard here. And I think when we talk about maritime strategy, maritime security, the security of our country, it's good to have us linked in. We have both our Title X responsibilities, but we also provide that link between the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. We speak the same language, and there should not be any seam, there should not be any gap between Homeland Security and national defense. So one of the things that I've been trying to focus on, and actually the new strategy has played into something that I've been talking about for years, is the fact that the Coast Guard, within the limits of its resources, really needs to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And with the drawdown of Navy ships in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, particularly in the trafficking zones between South and Central America, and due to the effects of sequestration, we're finding ourselves hard-pressed to be able to put enough assets down there to interdict those threats and those boats in transit that we know are out there, but just don't have the resources to get to. So with the rebalance to the Pacific and many of the Navy ships forward deploying, and I agree with that. We need our Navy to be forward deployed and ready to project power. The Coast Guard has to reassess some of the things that we've done. We've always been present in the Pacific, but we're having to reassess due to tighter squeeze on the budget and fewer ships, fewer major ships available. Where do we place them? So we will be coming out. I told you last year that we were coming out with an Arctic strategy, and I'm very pleased to tell you that we published that last spring. But we're also working now on a Western Hemisphere strategy, because the threats that are facing our country are more decentralized now. They're self-motivated. They're harder to identify. And we are looking at how we lay down our forces in order to provide that layered security approach as those threats approach our shore.
Thanks, sir. Just a follow-up question. You know, in the China panel earlier today, a khaki-wearing person said these words. They said, you know, as you look at what you really want out of a Navy, is you want to prevent and deter Navy and Marine Corps together, preventing and deterring. But they also commented that they thought there should be more white hulls further out in the Pacific. Could you comment on that?
Well, we don't have a lot more white hulls to push out into the Pacific, but what we do have is we have Coast Guard expertise to work with our partners in the Pacific. You know, our first and major partner is the United States Navy. Admiral Locklear, even though we've lost some of the Navy ships in the Western Hemisphere that supported some of our missions, he now has us putting law enforcement detachments on Navy frigates and destroyers that are transiting Oceania. And we have a huge, I think I had a chart up here just a short while ago, and maybe they can put up that first slide. We've got a huge exclusive economic zone that extends throughout the Pacific that we're responsible for. Not to mention the fact that we have a lot of partners out there. All those blue areas that you see outlined are our exclusive economic zone, 4.5 million square miles of exclusive economic zone. The United States has the largest EEZ in the world. And those pink areas that you see are the potential for extended outer continental shelf claims, all of which have laws, treaties, and things that need to be enforced. Because we don't have enough ships to push them forward, you're exactly right. Other countries are learning. We're working in China. I was the first service chief to travel to Vietnam. Vietnam is creating a Coast Guard now. China has reorganized its 5 maritime forces that they refer to as the 5 Dragons into a Coast Guard. They've even painted their ships white, put the stripes on them, and used the same font lettering that we use to say China Coast Guard on the side.
Are you getting a cut on that? I mean,
no, we didn't. You know, we didn't have it copyrighted. You know, who knew? But it doesn't matter. It's China, it's Korea, it's Japan, it's Vietnam, it's Australia, it's New Zealand. We're learning together and working cooperatively so that we can do those activities that prevent us from having to use our Navies and Marine Corps.
Thanks, sir. For General Amos, as leader of our nation's Expeditionary Crisis Response Force and the person responsible to ensure our nation has an amphibious, forcible entry capability in the anti-access area denial environment, can you please talk about how our health is in that area as we refocus back from the land-centric contests that we've been in, the conflicts we've been in, towards the Pacific? And something that's come up several times in the conference has been connectors. General Tulin talked about that and others.
Pete, first of all, I think you got to begin with how you believe the world's going to look over the next couple of decades. You got to look at the security environment. Admiral Ferguson did a great job of kind of painting the environment from a maritime perspective, and he's got it right. The world that we're going to live in and operate in for the next 2 decades, my personal opinion is going to be a world where American forces aren't just going to be welcomed on sovereign soil of other nations. They're going to want to train with us. They're going to want our help with helping their borders and setting up their militaries. But they're not going to want us to build bases. Those days, for the near term, are gone. We have a few select bases overseas, but and we nurture those and work with our partners. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of what's going to take place in the world in the future is going to come from the sea. It's going to come from a sea base, and we tend to think a sea base is some huge floating armada with. I was just reading about the invasion of Normandy here a week ago. Again, and just the 5,000 ships in the Channel. I mean, it could be 2 or 3 ships. It could be an ARG Mu. That could be the beginning of a sea base. So my point in bringing that up is that the types of ships we're going to likely need to engage and to train and build partnership and build trust, I would argue that most utilitarian of all the ships that we have is probably a derivative of or a version of an amphibious ship. The problem we have is they're not real sexy looking. They're not pointy and they don't shine real bright, but they're the Swiss Army knife of the fleet. I mean, they can do an awful lot that, quite honestly, this world is going to need us to be able to do for the next 2 decades, and that's the reason why I started with the security environment. So back to the issue of do we have enough and where we headed and the importance on connectors. The truth of the matter is we don't have enough amphibious ships right now. And that's, I mean, that's a fact. We're meeting less than half the needs of the combatant commanders. But we're balancing the budget that Mark Ferguson talked about. We're trying to cut Solomon's baby in precisely these different spots so we can do the best we can with a budget. I'm convinced that the partnership between the Navy and the Marine Corps here is so strong that we're going to do the very best we possibly can. We're going to do the very best we can that Congress allows us to become as a result to the amount of ships. But we need more amphibious ships. Now, when you start talking about a sea base, and you start thinking about A2AD and the threat of the future, that sea base in a conflicted environment or a challenged environment, it's going to be out at sea.
Sure.
So connectors are really, really important. And we get a lot of discussion about how you move Marines on the surface from a sea base ashore. And I'd argue that rather than trying to take the mountain to Muhammad, let's figure out how we can take Muhammad to the mountain. And that's through connectors. We need connectors that can not only haul a lot of stuff, but we need connectors that actually can go to high speed. We start talking about the occasional requirement to move from a sea base in a contested environment in a high water speed type mode. And I'd argue that the best way to do that is via a connector. A connector that can leave a sea base that's 75, 80 miles off coast and can go 120 miles downrange and then turn into the coastline and then discharge its Marines in some form or fashion. We've not, I'll tell you what, we have a couple of programs. We've got a new LCAC program called the SSC. That's funded, and that's the new upgrade version of the LCAC. We have a LCU program, a replacement program for that great old workhorse ship. So that's underway, but that's not going to be enough. What we really need, and I'm talking to industry out here, we need to change the paradigm. We tend to think of connectors as something that we carry in the bowels of an amphibious ship. And I'll tell you, we're going to need that. I'm not saying you don't need that. But imagine bringing together a sea base in some contested part of the world where you need a large force that's going to come from sea. You're not going to have enough connectors that you're just going to be carrying organically with your shipping that you have. But if you had some connectors that would go high speed when required, but perhaps fold up, and perhaps be able to stack these connectors on some type of gray-bottom ship, black-bottom ship, and then it just at the signs of indications and warnings when something as bad is going to happen in some area where you're really getting nervous, you have a sense you're going to have to bring a large force together, then you sail that ship. Something that would otherwise carry containers, and maybe it has something like a lighterage.
Right.
And stacked on the deck of that ship are 20 or 30 of these connectors that fold up, and it'll go 35 or 40 knots, and will carry stuff and Marines. And then you bring it into the sea base the same way you bring in MPS from Diego Garcia, from Guam. You bring it together. So I'd argue that we need to change the way we think about connectors. And I'll tell you, I'm committed. I've told my money guy, and we just talked about it last week, we're willing to put some money into R&D for future technology with regards to connectors. This is something I think we've woefully missed the mark on, and it's now time to step up the game on connectors.
Sir, thank you. For Admiral Ferguson, a follow-on to General Amos's comment, you know, it seems like after this time that we've spent with this big footprint ashore in Iraq and Afghanistan, that it seems like the American people are weary of another one of those. And so the message of doing it from the sea, as the Commandant mentioned, just seems like it would resonate. I want to ask you a two-part question. One is, you're doing this quadrennial defense review. It's wrapping up now. Is that resonating within the building? Is that message of, be able to dial it in, dial it out, and come from the sea working? And what ways do you see the Navy implementing the revised maritime strategy kind of in that context of leveraging those advantages?
I think the strongest resonating is the combatant commanders who are seeing, as General Amos talked about, that coming from the global common and sea is really the advantage that the Navy and Marine Corps bring to meeting their Phase 0 and Phase 1 theater requirements. And you can see that in the ships now that we're starting to deploy. We've got the Joint High-Speed Vessel now in Africa and Europe that's operating. We're going to test flying an Osprey on and off that and some other things to see, can that fulfill a need for us? The float forward staging base that we're doing now blends some of these support for both the minesweepers in the Gulf as well as special forces, and that afloat forward staging base concept, which we have here at NASCO, is going to be extraordinarily important to our future because it gives us that ability to operate in areas such as Africa and the Middle East with Marines and with special forces. What we see in these investments that I talked about in this proliferation of anti-access technologies, we think we have to make investments to pace that for the future. And we see now that it's not just an arms race of weapons, but it's really networks fighting networks, be they terrorist networks, or in our case, our own command and control, the things that we rely on in cyber or out of space are now increasingly under challenge, and we have to say, what happens if they go away? What happens if we have to back those up or move to a different arena? And I think those implementations are important. I think that, as we look at the partnership piece, that General Amos has it right, is that other nations, particularly in the Pacific region, want us to be there and work with them both in building their military as well as strengthening our own partnership, because they feel the pressure that they're under in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you maybe a follow-up on that, is that didn't you just recently go to China?
I did. Fascinating visit. I took a delegation over. I had hosted the head of their carrier aviation program, Admiral Zhang, who brought their first carrier in last year, and as a reciprocal, I went in December. Was able and hosted by the chief of their Navy, Wu Shangli, at those of you that know China, the Daly Guest House, which is where Mao hosted Nixon when he went. It was a red carpet from the moment we arrived to the end. Access to their ships, rode a DDG, one of their new ones, got underway on a Corvette, went on a submarine, visited many of their commands, met the EC fleet commander. So in one sense, it was interesting, as we talk about that, I'll give you an observation. So in a span of about 6 hours, my first meeting was with the Center for Contemporary International Relations, which is one of their think tanks of state security. And it was on the day that the typhoon hit the Philippines. And we asked them the question, well, the Navy and the Marines are responding immediately. We are sending forces to the Philippines to provide assistance to our ally and partner. What is China going to do? And the answer we got back was very interesting, and it said, well, that's really up to the Philippines on how they behave as to whether we'll send aid or not. And within about 24 to 48 hours, they had made an offer of $100,000, and that was it. The papers in Beijing, where the headlines were, China's not responding as an appropriate partner, they're not sending aid support, whereas the U.S. offered millions in aid, we had flowed forces. And so they reversed themselves in a few days, but it kind of showed one aspect of that what I call the political toughness aspect that we're seeing in some of the actions in the East and South China Sea. I contrast that with my meeting with Admiral Wu later that evening, which was open, transparent, red carpet, access to whatever you want and see, and in fact, we had long discussions about how do we mitigate concerns regarding the interactions of our forces when they meet on the high seas. And to the point of talking about bridge-to-bridge communications in English, and we had commended one of their COs for that. And Wu made a commitment, and we have seen it in action of him bringing English speakers on their bridges of their ships and engaging in that dialogue to try and diffuse tension. So the sinusoidal pattern, as we referred to it, we see it in the political dynamic on one aspect, and then on the military dynamic, desire for increased cooperation and transparency.
General Amos, I think I missed a signal earlier. You wanted to get in on that other thread.
No, that was pretty perceptive, Peter, but you did good. I was just before, and when Mark had spoken about his trip to China, it was fascinating. I mean, the whole thing was fascinating. So, but on this connector thing, since we've got industry here, and I realize we're talking principally to the technical aspect of industry here, but you know, we're building 10 joint high-speed vessels. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm starting to nag here a little bit, but we've got building 10 high-speed vessels that are phenomenal crap. Imagine if we could load vehicles at sea from a sea base onto those joint high-speed vessels. And then we could use them to discharge vehicles off the beach somewhere 1,000 yards, 5,000 yards out. And yet, we're building these and we don't have that capability. That sea base with the MLP and all the other stuff that we're putting out there, the LMSRs with the afloat, with the articulating and gyro-stabilized crane and all that stuff, we're going to have a lot of capabilities. So I just implore everybody in the industry here, we need to put some money to this thing and get these joint high-speed vessels where we can actually bring surface craft on board at sea and then discharge those.
And I would also add, I mean, General Amos and I went down, met with Bill McCraven, and we talked about as we transition, you know, out of Afghanistan and Iraq, the reintegration of special operations forces with the embarked Marines and their teams. We're putting them on our vessels as well, and so I think, you know, part of this is how do we combat these networks that are global?
I'm going to come back to the Coast Guard in a minute because we haven't asked Admiral Papp a question in the last couple minutes. But since you were nagging, General Amos, we've talked about a lot, and certainly we've seen with the Special Purpose MAGTF, the one that's based in Spain, that's going to provide a reaction and contingency force capability for that theater. We've seen that action, saw that piece about McCraven the other day, about getting the SEALs back out with the amphibious ready groups and the Marine Expeditionary Units afloat on the Navy amphibious shipping. But there's also been a lot of talk over the past couple years about getting Marines out in different size force packages down to the smaller ships. And I was wondering, it doesn't seem like there's been as much action on that as I expected. And I was wondering, is that because there are other priorities, or is it that the Navy's not matching up, or the Navy, for the Navy side, is it the Marines aren't interested in that? What's between us and getting that done?
I think we're on the cusp of that, Peter. I'll be honest with you. There's a lot of creative juices flowing around within the dawn now between the Department of the Navy and our two services on how do you best contribute to this thing they call the new world, and you know, and all that. How do you do that? The Special Purpose MAGTF, which for everybody out here, it was a Marine Air Ground Task Force that was really cobbled together after the Benghazi attack, and the realization that, boy, how could we contribute to AFRICOM, the commander, in the future, in this kind of security environment, if something like this happens again? Right. I mean, what can we do? Mm-hmm. And so we put together and we said, okay, well, let's take a Marine Rifle Company and we'll put some special capabilities with it, and then we'll add a pretty good slice of logistics, and we'll give them 6 MB-22s and 2 C-130s, and then we just gave it to the AFRICOM commander and said, here they are, they're yours, you can do what you want to with them, we'll bring them, we'll rotate them, they'll be trained, and but you got to find a place for them to live. And so right now they're based in Spain. Spain has been gracious enough to allow them to do that. They forward stage out of SIG, and they've been used ever since they got there on the African continent. They flew 3,400 miles nonstop in 4 MB-22s being drug along by 2 C-130s down to Djibouti, then on down to Entebbe. So that's the relevance of what we're talking about. But back to this issue of are there things that are causing us to not bring smaller packages together? I don't believe there are. I think at this point right now, we're probably only limited by our imagination. I'll give you a good example. I'm a fan of the LCS. I mean, I've been on both ships, been to both shipyards. I like it. I see why the Navy's buying it. When the ship was designed, it was not designed with an idea towards a small penny packet of Marines on board. But why not? That ship that comes out of Mobile, it's got a huge cavernous deck below the main deck. So why couldn't we do that? And the answer is we can. And I think we're going to get there. I think that collaborative, cooperative spirit between the Navy and the Marine Corps on this thing is I've never seen it better, number one, ever, in my 43 years of being a Marine. And I want to brag about that relationship with the Navy and the relationship that not only I have with Mark, but his boss, John Greenard. There's not an ounce of space between either one of us. But I think we're just limited by our imagination now. I think we're going to be forced to do these creative kind of things so we can get out and be and engage these countries and be that force for good that we talk about.
Yes, sir. Thanks for that answer. For Admiral Papp, I was going to say, we're going through this revision. The strategy will be out in a little bit, but you must have some thoughts, and you're sitting here working with the Marine Corps and the Navy, and the Coast Guard is so much smaller. What are the elements of the strategy that you are seeking to preserve? What's an important priority for you as the Commandant of the Coast Guard?
Well, first of all, it is good to be here, and General Amos never gets any sympathy over in the tank when he starts whining about being the smallest service. I have to remind him. On the other hand,
we're brother commandants, so we got to take care of it.
Absolutely. On the other hand, I was in London recently and had a chance to have breakfast with the First Sea Lord, and he reminded me that the United States Coast Guard is larger than the British Navy now. So
it's all relative.
It is all relative, and we're very fortunate. The thing I'd like to see is actually two things. We have expanding operations space up in the Arctic. That's why last year when I was out here, I spoke about our upcoming Arctic strategy, which was in the final stages of clearance back then. We were able to launch it last spring, and the challenge is, how do you address resourcing? Strategies are written, and then you need to resource to those strategies. And lots of times what we're finding is that the resourcing does not come out matching the strategy. And then we're faced to start using risk-based decision models to come up, where do we put our forces? Rightly so, Department of Defense just came out with their Arctic strategy recently. And I think as they have projected, there's really no defense threat up there. The Navy's going to stay familiar with the Arctic, but it's really Coast Guard equities up there. We're dealing with something that goes beyond national defense, pure national defense. We're working broad national security, environmental security, economic security, energy security, and all others up there. That's the day-to-day business of what I've referred to over the last year as maritime governance. Maritime governance is the day-to-day things that go on for a maritime nation. Given that we are the strongest, most powerful maritime nation in the world, it's only right that we have the best Navy, the best Marine Corps. We also need the best Coast Guard. And it was last year that actually Jim Amos coalesced my thoughts before we put the final touches on the Arctic strategy. And it's that for at least the next decade, we're projecting for the next decade, we don't need to build permanent shore infrastructure, which is hugely expensive up in the Arctic, up on the North Slope. This is where maritime forces come into play, because you can bring them on scene, use them as long as they're needed, and then retract them afterwards. and then reutilize them for other missions, other purposes. For the last 2 years, we've sent the National Security Cutter, our new National Security Cutter, up there. All three of them have been up there at various times now. They are a floating Coast Guard sector. They are an air station. They are a command center with worldwide command and control capabilities. They can launch up to 3 boats with boat crews, and they can provide initial response for any sort of maritime governance issue that comes up as we see the increased traffic going on up in the Arctic. So what I want to see reflected in the strategy is this broader concept of maritime governance, defense being a part of that, but also the day-to-day issues that go on for a maritime country, and also reflecting that new, the Department of Defense would refer to it as battle space, but this new area of operations that we have expanding as we see the ice retracting up there.
Thank you, sir. You know, this question is really for Admiral Ferguson and General Amos, but you know, the Soviets used to have an expression that quantity has a quality all its own. And we heard from Christine Fox on Tuesday morning that we're going to get smaller. And she also said, you know, there's the realities. You have to be informed by your resource environment. And she also said if you don't want to go hollow, you're going to have to cut some numbers. I was going to ask from the Navy perspective, do you feel you have the numbers to cover the strategy that we have? And maybe don't even get away from, we can get away from, for a moment from the maritime strategy and just talk about the defense strategy. Are we in a mismatch between what we say we want to do and what we're really able to do?
I think all the service chiefs, I know the CNO has testified last year that when we submitted our presidential budget in 2014, we said that we could meet the strategy in the environment that we saw at that point with those resources. Now, since that time, and supporting that, we've done a force structure assessment, we've done our 30-year shipbuilding report to Congress, and so we've built a body of analysis that lays out what we believe the requirements to be. We're going to have a difficult time if we revert in fiscal year 16 to sequestration levels of the budget when we go back down, because the budget agreement with the Congress presently goes for 14 and 15. And so as we go into 16, if it reverts back to that level, it's going to be difficult for us to meet that with the force structure reductions that we're going to have to take out. The way that we look at it as we make these risk trades that I talked about is we have to think about the Navy has to be relevant in terms of pacing the threats that we see to ensure the Marines get access, to ensure that we can be the joint force enabler. We have to have the forces that we have ready, because when the combatant commanders call, that they have to show up and have to fight in this very complex environment when they get forward. And so what we're left with is we're going to have to get smaller to meet a fiscal target that's imposed for 16 and out. And it's going to make it difficult, if not impossible, for us to meet it at the current defense strategies that's laid out with those type of fiscal levels.
Thank you. General Amos, do we have enough Marines in the plan?
Under the, for the current strategy, as is published today, and it's not been revised, we do today, we are on our way down to some number around 175,000. That will, for the Marine Corps, will be able to execute the strategy. Each service approaches this just a little bit differently. From you know, it's and they don't approach the importance of the strategy differently, but resource-wise and ability-wise, each service enters their piece of the strategy just a little bit different and unique. We can do the strategy, but in our case, we will be for the day-to-day sustained operations that are going to be required. That's actually a greater requirement for the Marine Corps than a major theater war somewhere. We have a sense of what that major theater war would require in the way of, in our case, it's infantry battalions, and everything else applies to, you know, is multiplied on top, layered on top of an infantry battalion. So we got a pretty good idea exactly what that requirement is. The day-to-day steady state requirements exceed that. So as we look at steady state, the things we do, the training, the MEWS, the forward deployments, the special purpose MAGTFs, the RFF, the response forces that are required to deploy around the world as a result of something going on, exceeds the capacity that we have and will have when we go down to 175,000. So the answer is wartime, yes. Steady state, going to be pretty strained.
Got it. That makes sense to me because you can clean out the barn for the big one, but the sustainable marathon pace is a longer race.
It is, and I tell you, I just make this comment. You know, there's talk that we're going to do less with less, and there's going to be a peace dividend post December of 2014. I don't think there's going to be a peace dividend. I don't see it. And if you just go back in history, there is zero historical framework for you're going to do less once you come out of it. The world is not going to allow you to do that. We're going to be driven to do things, participate, engage, be a part. We've got global responsibilities. I mean, this is we're a maritime nation, that's obvious, and we've existed in peace as a maritime nation for our 238 years because we've got the oceans on both sides of us, and we've got friends on the north and the south. But this is a maritime nation, and we have global responsibilities in that capacity or in that area. And I'll tell you, we're not going to be allowed to just come back. We are not going to do less with less. We are going to do the same with less. And that is a dangerous solution that drives you to a hollow force.
Yes, sir, I understand. For Admiral Papp, I'll phrase this slightly differently. Sir, you've only got a few more months on station as the Commandant of the Coast Guard. And you talk about numbers and you talk about the posture of the Coast Guard. I'll phrase this a little differently. What is going to keep your relief up at night? What are going to be the hard ones as we move to the future for the capacity and capability of the Coast Guard?
I think the challenge that my relief will face, and hopefully I'm leaving him positioned as well as possible, is the recapitalization of our fleet. We deal in a layered maritime security regime. We've done a good job, I think, over the last 10 years. We've recapitalized almost all our shore forces. We have bought, I think we're nearing 170 new response boats that have gone out to our stations. We've recapitalized our small boat fleet. We've put more conventional Coast Guardsmen at our stations. We've created deployable specialized forces. And we're building new patrol boats. We have more patrol boats than we've ever had in our history, and we're building more. We've got funding for 30 of our new fast response cutters. That's about half of the fleet that we're building there. We're going to get a fleet of 58. But as I told Congress the other day in my first hearing of the budget season, that's when you're dealing with threats in the coastal and nearshore zone,
right.
In football terms, you're in the red zone. You are defending the goal line at that point. And while it's good to have those forces, and they might make you feel good because they're highly visible and they're there, you need maritime patrol forces that can go out beyond the exclusive economic zone, that patrol out on the high seas, and that can intercept threats before they get into that red zone. That is where the Coast Guard is woefully inadequate at this point. Our high endurance cutters that have done a great job for us, but they've done a great job for us for 45 years. There's enough Navy people in the room that almost recoil when they hear a major capital ship that's a destroyer or frigate type ship that's 45 years old. Our medium endurance cutters that are the workhorse of our fleet are approaching 50 years old. We've got to replace those ships. So what we're dealing with in order to affect this strategy is diminishing resources. And how is the country going to allocate those scarce resources as we go forward? I've been making the case as powerfully and as constantly and steadily as I can that for the Coast Guard, we've got to recapitalize that fleet that's offshore. The National Security Cutter is in sight. I have to tell you that there were people that told me when I became Commandant we might curtail that at 4 ships or 5 ships. We're about ready to award long lead material purchases for number 8, and I'm relatively confident when the 15 budget comes through. I'm very hopeful that the administration will put forward the construction cost for 8. So we will be at the program of record. The next big project is the largest project that the Coast Guard has ever taken on, and that is the offshore patrol cutter, replacing the 210-foot Reliance class medium endurance cutters, and then eventually our 270-foot medium endurance cutters. We plan to buy 25 of those ships. We just down selected for preliminary contract design 3 contractors this week, and I was a little worried that perhaps we wouldn't get that done, and then that would have been a big headache for my relief. But we have set out, we had a number of goals I set out 4 years ago to do. We have accomplished all those goals, and I think we have prepared the battlefield for my successor as well as we can. And then it's going to be his responsibility to take it forward.
Sir, thanks. A question we got from the audience, but I'll do the lead-in for it. General Amos just mentioned that we've enjoyed over 2 centuries plus the fact that we are a maritime nation and we have the protection of the oceans that surround us. And you know, but people do lose sight of the fact occasionally that we are a maritime country. But now that battle space has collapsed, and a question we got from the audience was, what about cyber? And I'd like to ask Admiral Ferguson and then maybe General Amos about how, the question is, how do you prioritize the advanced cyber threats as a challenge? How do you view that challenge to our forward deployed forces?
I think you have to look at cyber as, you know, now contested space. And I kind of categorize the threat as I see it in several tiers or arenas of conflict. The first that applies to many of you in this room as clear defense contractors is the systematic attacks that are against your networks, and we see the exfiltration of American intellectual capital overseas to both state and non-state actors who are coming after every advantage that we have in the technology arena. The second would be a growing awareness on our part of the vulnerability of our own infrastructure and its networks. Think power grids, various infrastructure pieces that are vulnerable to cyber attack that we have to start thinking about defending as a nation. And third, as we think of our own networks forward, it's a twofold problem. One is it's the problem that we rely very heavily in the way that we use our forces and fight our forces in collaborative networks that are moving information in large pieces of it between platforms, between command posts and decision makers, and that provides a force multiplier for us to apply force in an appropriate way. And so there's a threat of those networks being disrupted. There's threats in the future of potentially disrupting both the electromagnetic spectrum as well as the navigation signals that we rely on for those systems to work in the future. And so, again, I think we have to start thinking about that being contested space and then how it degrades in a high-end engagement that we can continue to operate through it.
Can we expect, for the Vice Chief, can we expect to see cyber get that kind of marquee treatment in the strategy?
I think I would expect it to, and it would be one of the things I would look to happen. And we've already stood up 10th Fleet based at Fort Meade, and the last time we stood up 10th Fleet was in the 1942 in response to the German U-boat threat in the Battle of the Atlantic, and that fleet was focused on solving a cross-domain threat on how do we marshal resources to get convoys to Europe. So 10th Fleet now is both our defense teams, attack teams. I would tell you that's an area of growth in the budget as well as in the strategy for the future.
Admiral Papp, you also had something on that one.
I did. You mentioned these two guys might have some interest in this, but people sometimes forget the Coast Guard's intimately involved in this as well. You know, you have a longshoreman strike in the port of LA Long Beach, which we had a couple years ago, and all of a sudden the shelves in Walmarts start going empty because our economy is based on just-in-time delivery. That's just a strike. Imagine a cyber strike on our port facilities, much of which, if you go into a container terminal today, there are very few longshoremen there. Containers are picked up by computer, delivered to the right ship or taken off the correct ship. Trucks are positioned. It's all interconnected nowadays, and that's part of the infrastructure that could be hit. We are intimately involved. For General Alexander, his 6 at Cyber Command is a Coast Guard flag officer, and we have had one there for a number of years. And because of our relationship under Title X, we have Coast Guard Cyber Command as well. And once again, going back to my opening statement, it provides that link between the Department of Defense back to the Department of Homeland Security, which has responsibilities domestically for protecting our cyber infrastructure and the restoration should we have an attack.
General Amos, your Marines have enjoyed the benefits of a ton of bandwidth in a pretty permissive environment overall, not permissive from the standpoint of bullets, but permissive from control of the spectrum and encountering denied C2 environments. As the strategy shifts towards Asia Pacific and some of the other priorities, what's the concern that you have in the cyber area?
First of all, it's the reality of that this is a growth industry, and we are just on the cusp of this. If you focus on it, it's almost frightening. We have to pay the freight in people and money and equipment and training, and we all are doing that right now. All the services are doing that. And it's interesting because if you get to the more visceral part of my service and you start looking at manpower and what it's going to cost, I'll get a lot of help and say, sir, we don't need this. Yeah. We're the Marines. We don't need this kind of technology and capability. Boy, I'll tell you what, they couldn't be farther from the road. We don't have a choice. We've always been involved in the kind of the early stages of this through our signals intelligence and our radio battalions, and they've been deployed with the Marines. They've been kind of a piece of this. They've always had a direct link into the National Security Agency. We work Marines on the National Security Agency staff. We rotate them in and out to our battalions. It's a great relationship, and it builds a bench that's pretty deep, but it's not deep enough.
Sure.
Imagine a commander of any of our services being out in an environment where he or she or their staff now has to help the commander make a decision, a significant wartime decision, and something as simple as you don't have confidence in the information being displayed, or the information that's coming into your command center. You're just not quite sure. And why aren't you quite sure? Because there's indications that somebody else is in your network. Somebody else is feeding you information. They're not just pulling the plug and shutting it down. That's actually, you wouldn't want it. It's not easy, but that's actually easy. You at least know what you have. But how about the element of doubt? And the element of doubt now takes time to resolve. And the time that you've just spent trying to resolve this thing gives the enemy the advantage that he or she would not otherwise have. So this is real. It's a burgeoning industry. And I think we haven't even begun to understand the magnitude and the vulnerabilities we have. The Department of Defense is led by that great patriot, Keith Alexander, has been after this now faithfully. The services are coming on board. We get it. We're just not there yet, Peter. We've got a long ways to go.
Sir, thanks for that answer. Another question from the audience. We're getting close to the end here of time, but a question is, are you able to comment on your work with the Southeast Asian countries and the coalition or the potential for coalition partners there to ensure stability? And in your mind's eye, do you view China as one of those potential partners? And I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll jump on that. I think China absolutely needs to become one of those partners. And my sense is, I'm optimistic that they will. We're not there yet. It needs to begin with a whole host of interactions, not just with the military, but with other elements of the national power. And I think we're going to get there. It's in our best interest, and it's in theirs. You know, Mark was in China, was received extremely warmly. There's an effort underway now to try to get more what we call mill-to-mill, and it'll begin with the senior leadership. And I think you're going to see that over the next 12 to 24 months. I know we were invited. I know CNO's been invited. He and I were invited to go in there, and we're looking forward to it. So that's that. But in the other Asia-Pacific nations, the answer is yes. You know, we left the Philippines 35 years ago. And all of us old guys remember, you know, what a great opportunity that was to train there and to stage out of there and base out of there. Well, the relationships with the Philippines is a great example. I mean, that is growing stronger every day. It's personal, it's by name, and I would argue that when this typhoon, this 195-mile-an-hour typhoon, came across the southeastern part of the Philippines and killed 6,000 people, the relationships over the phone, by name, commander to commander, was what allowed, in our case, a Marine Brigadier General to be on the ground within 8 hours after the storm flew over. On the ground, 8 hours, B-22s, the carrier George Washington came down, we flew down equipment, and then began to be the seed corn for this huge international aid effort for the Philippines. But that began with relationships. We're training there now. The Malaysian Chief of Defense came by to see me 2 weeks ago. The Chief of Defense of the Singapore military came by to see me 3 weeks. I'm going to go see them in about 2 months. I'm paying a call on them. So our relationships there are building. I like what Admiral Papp has said about Vietnam. I think that's absolutely fertile ground, and why not? I mean, look at where it is strategically in that part of the world. You come right around a corner, and you're in the Straits of Malacca, where a big chunk of the world's commerce travels through there. So all of that's there. Of course, our relationship with Australia is strong. So I think we're working it pretty hard.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Papp?
On a day-to-day basis, we have to have those relationships. You know, you mentioned the security that those oceans once provided us, and history sort of repeats itself. You know, Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, in 11 he talked about the need for the Navy. In 12 he talked about the need for a coastal force. In both of them he talked about the prodigious security that the ocean provides for us. Well, that prodigious security is gone. And when he talked about needing security that started at the entrances of our ports, the entrances of our ports are in places now like Singapore and Beijing and other places where containers are loaded and brought to our country. So on a very real day-to-day basis, we've got Coast Guard people in those countries under treaty, the International Ship and Port Security Code, doing inspections to make sure that those countries are following the proper security procedures before they load cargo that's bound for the United States. And they also have reciprocal privileges. They've grown to trust Coast Guard people. Some people are surprised that one of the best avenues for communication with the government of China right now is through the United States Coast Guard. We have, for about a decade now, we have something called the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, which includes Canada, the United States, Korea, Japan, Russia, and China. And we have built up a sense of trust with China. In fact, we are now collaboratively working fisheries cases, high seas drift net cases, where 2 years ago we had a Chinese registered vessel with a multinational crew. We could have taken it to one of our ports for prosecution. We've built up enough trust with them that we escorted the ship to the Chinese fisheries authorities and had them take it. We follow up and we watch, and they conduct the prosecution. We know this because we've got an 06. We've got a captain in the embassy in Beijing that regularly talks with our partners over there. Just like now, at the invitation of Vietnam, we're going to have a Coast Guard 06 in our embassy in Hanoi this coming year to continue some of the initial productive meetings that we've had, some of the training that we've conducted, so that they can take on those maritime governance functions that I was talking about earlier.
Thank you.
I would just add, I'd like to, you know, align myself with my good friend Sam Locklear, PACOM commander, who says that the challenge of our time is to transition China from being a consumer to a net provider of security in that region. It's an important aspect of the strategy of engagement, both with our partners and allies as well as with the PLA Navy.
Well, thank you. Well, I think this is about it. I thought maybe I'd take a risk here and take 30 more seconds for each of you. We've touched on this a bit, but we got a lot of industry and audience here, and if you, from your perspective as leaders of your respective services, could ask industry for help on one thing, what might that be? And I'll start this with Admiral Papp, but what's one thing that you could say, well, I need help on this?
Affordability. You can keep a word count in my hearing questions and statements this year when I go up to the Hill. Everything that we're doing is within a constrained environment. And a lot of times, I'm not casting any aspersions here for the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has always had a lot more money than the Coast Guard. And oftentimes, particularly now that we're dealing with larger contractors, they think the same old rules apply. We can't afford it. And we have to get the bang for every single buck that we spend. So there are some magnificent technological solutions to everything that we want to do, but it costs too much. We're trying to build ships, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to be scrutinizing these candidates for the offshore patrol cutter because affordability will be our #1 requirement. And I've committed that to my secretary, I've committed it to OMB and the President, that we're going to build affordable ships that were within the limits that they are placing on us. So whether it's IT systems, ship construction, it's got to be affordable. People have to be coming up with alternate solutions, scaled responses that fit within the budgets that are increasingly constrained.
Thank you. I was going to ask General Amos to take that swing at that.
Pete, I was actually going to jump back on my connector soapbox, but I like the hell out of what you said. And, I'd just like to add kind of a part 2 to that. You know, we've spent the last 3 years trying to decide and determine what we're going to do for our new amphibious combat vehicle. And that would have been probably an easy choice to make if the cost and capabilities and those kinds of things weren't such a driving factor on this thing. So to Admiral Papp's position on this thing, not only affordable, but we need partnership. We need a partnership as we develop the way ahead on some of the things that we need in our Marine Corps. Connectors are just one of them. But as we move forward with decisions on the amphibious combat vehicle solution, that has got to not only be affordable, but it's got to be a partnership when you start thinking about acquisition and procurement and production timelines, because in the case of this, these vehicles are well over 40 years. And if you think I'm going to wait for a 12-year acquisition timeline to get out to IOC, you're crazy.
Right.
So there's got to be a partner. There's got to be a collaboration and a willingness to doing things legally, but to come together and try to determine how can we do this cheaper, faster, and more collaboratively, so that we don't end up with a bunch of overruns. But I think partnership in my case is what I'd pile on.
We had, before Admiral Ferguson answers the question, we had an industry panel this morning, and it's fascinating to me that they talked about partnership, dialogue, better understanding of what you want, and then a streamlined compliance activity, knowing that you have to comply so that they could deliver you a more affordable product, maybe even sell it to other people and get the economic order quantity in the right place. So it was very interesting that that the first 2 answers come at it from just the same place. And then
collaboration's got to begin at the beginning. And the problem is that the way the system is set up right now, it doesn't begin until later on, until a whole lot of things, to include the requirements have been solidified and everything else. The collaboration, the art of the possible, doesn't begin until later on. And it needs to begin, the discussion needs to begin up front, so that you can determine together what the art of the possible, both production-wise, capability-wise, and cost-wise is.
Sir. Admiral Ferguson.
I'm going to say innovation. This year, we're going to put our first directed energy weapon on the Ponce in the Middle East. We flew an unmanned aircraft onto and off an aircraft carrier. We are looking at really, as we talked about, this change of a domain in both the electromagnetic spectrum, which is going to be maneuver space for us, and the cyberspace. The best ideas come out of your laboratories, your thinking, the work you're doing, and you're looking at a problem from a different perspective, you know, and to follow on the two. It has to be affordable, it has to be in partnership with our own scientists, our own engineers, but I think the edge that we're going to need going into the future is going to be innovation, and that's what's going to fuel us going forward.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say thank you again. It's been our honor to have these three incredible officers join us here today. And I know that Kent's going to ask us to wrap this up, so I just say thank you very much.
Good. Thanks, Peter.
Give him a hand.
Thanks for having us.